I think I need to drink some water. I wonder if my tea is cold enough to drink yet. Hello, my name is Regis. Welcome back to my channel. Thank you for being here. I'm too close to the camera. Today, I just wanted to do a little wrap up for the month of September, just talk about the books that I read. Most of these I listened to on audio. I just didn't end up getting a lot of time to read anything in print this month, but I did end up finishing eight books. So without further ado, I'm just going to get into those. The first book I finished in September was Mary Jane by Jessica Anya Blau. I listened to this book on audio, and overall I would say that I did enjoy it, but I did sort of have mixed feelings about sort of the message of the book. Hang on, I gotta look up and see how old the protagonist is supposed to be in this book, because she's younger than I thought for most of the book, which makes me feel worse about it, honestly. This is a book about a girl named Mary Jane, as you might imagine, who's growing up in Baltimore, Maryland in the 1970s. She's 14 years old, she's an only child, and has very, strict, conservative Christian parents. Her mom teaches Sunday school and is a very dedicated homemaker. Her dad is, I believe, a lawyer, and just doesn't really seem to spend a lot of time with Mary Jane or, speak to her hardly even. He's very focused on his work, and when he's at home he just wants to relax, read the newspaper, very much sort of the stereotype of the, traditional conservative father of the day. So that's Mary Jane's experience. She doesn't necessarily seem unhappy with this and doesn't even seem to know that it's weird that her dad doesn't talk to her, but she ends up babysitting for a family for the summer. She's nannying for a 5-year-old girl whose name is Izzy, I believe, for Dr. and Mrs. Cohn. Once she gets there, Dr. Cohn, who is a psychiatrist, lets her know that he's going to be having one single patient staying with him the entire summer. He's a rock star. His name is Jimmy. He has a wife named Sheba, who is kind of like a Cher kind of character, who, has done acting, is musical, had a TV career, all this kind of stuff. And Jimmy has a drug addiction, and so Dr. Cohn is going to be treating him exclusively during the summer at the house where Mary Jane is going to be taking care of the child while Mrs. Cohn kind of keeps Sheba entertained and Dr. Cohn treats Jimmy. And so you have this situation where, of course, Mary Jane is exposed to a lot of things she's never seen before. She's very unfamiliar with the world of sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and this is all portrayed very positively in a lot of ways, that Mary Jane is being exposed to these things. And some of that is fair, but sometimes some of what Mary Jane is being exposed to is pretty inappropriate for a 14-year-old. It's weird that she sees adults who are not in her family naked and stuff like that. From my perspective, there are some lines that are crossed that there's a reason the line is there. So while I enjoyed the story, a lot of the characters were very likable. Mary Jane was very likable. I found her relatable in some ways, having grown up fairly sheltered myself. And it was really fun to kind of see the 1970s through her eyes. Lots of people are making the comparison to Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Well, I do think they're very different stories in terms of the structure and the protagonists that you're following. There are some similarities there. So if you enjoyed Daisy Jones and the Six, you might enjoy Mary Jane, particularly if you just are interested in that sort of 70s rock and roll scenario. Overall, I did kind of feel that the less uptight, more rock and roll adults were given kind of a pass, maybe, in some of their behavior more than they should have been, just by virtue of the fact that they were more loving and accepting and affectionate towards Mary Jane and her parents are. but that doesn't necessarily make up for other indiscretions. And I do think you get to see the balance of that in the book, which is good. I just think it tilted a little more in one direction than the other than I would have preferred. But overall, I think it was a really interesting book. I gave it 3 stars, which to me means like I liked it, I enjoyed it, but like it's not really like top notch. So that was Mary Jane by Jessica Anya Blau, and that's the first book that I read in September. The second book that I finished in September is actually the one book that I read in a physical edition, and it is somewhere on my shelf. I bent the corner, which makes me sad, in my backpack, sorry book. But I think the cover is actually quite pretty. But this is Seventh Son by Orson Scott Card. So this is the first book in Orson Scott Card's Tales of Elven Maker series. It's a fantasy series that's sort of an alternate history of the United States where there's magic involved. To give a small example that's not like too pertinent to most of the events of the story, Benjamin Franklin is considered like a wizard, not just like an inventor. And so there's magic involved, you know, particularly in the making of things. This particular book begins with the birth of the 7th son of a 7th son named Elvin. He has sort of a special power to make things that he is kind of learning in his childhood, what it means and how to relate to that power. I got interested in this series because I actually read a while ago a short story collection of Orson Scott Cards. I'm going to pull that off the shelf here too because I really do recommend it. This is Keeper of Dreams, a short story collection by Orson Scott Card, and there were a couple of short stories related to this series in here. It was Grinny Man was one, and the Yazoo Queen was the other. So I was just really intrigued by this sort of alternate history of the United States. I just thought it was an interesting concept because so often fantasy is set specifically in like a European, you know, sort of medieval setting. And so I thought that more of like a American frontier situation would be really interesting. The first part of this book I really enjoyed. I mean, Orson Scott Card writes so well. He says so many things that just like as you're reading it, you run across a sentence and you're like, wow, that's like so profound, or like such a stunning image. But sometimes, obvious example, Ender's Game aside, sometimes the stories don't end up hanging together as well as I wish they did. And this is kind of the case here. I actually started this book like the July long weekend, and I read kind of the first chunk of it and was really loving it. Then somehow or other I got distracted and didn't get back to it for a while. But the later part of the book, I kind of ended up having to like force myself through, and I did feel that it turns out not a whole lot happens in this book. It's really, I think, just set up for the rest of the series. It's kind of just Elvin's origin story, and I'm assuming that you're going to see him do more and probably more of his like adult life later in the series. I am still curious to read the second book in the series, which is called Red Prophet. So I'm curious to see how the series continues, but I do feel like it kind of failed to strike a good balance between stuff actually happening and just being world building, because I'm not sure that it achieved much of anything. Because as much as it's sort of setting things up, I still feel very uncertain about how the world of the story really works. Not so much in terms of the magic, but more in terms of like the political situation of the day, because it's different than the actual realities of like American politics in the frontier days, like in reality, but it's like not super clearly spelled out exactly in what ways it's different. So I did end up being a little bit disappointed by this one. I still ended up giving it 3 stars just because I did really enjoy the first few chapters so much. And I mean, there are really sort of interesting ideas here. There's a big contrast between how do like magic and religion, like specifically Christianity, interact and coexist in this world, and so I did find that interesting. So I will probably give this series one more shot, and then we'll see how that goes and go from there. So that's kind of my thoughts on that one. Curious to know if anybody has read this series, what they think of it. The next book that I finished is actually one that I read as an ebook on my phone because I couldn't get the audiobook, and that is The Harbor by Katrine Engberg. This is a Danish crime novel, and it's sort of the third one in the Kerner and Werner series about Danish police investigators. Here is the thing about this series that irritates me, and I have not been able to find any information about why, and I'm so curious, but I don't know the answer to this question. Books were originally written in Danish. They are publishing them out of order in English. They published the first one, which is called The Tenant, in English. Then there's a second one that they haven't published in English, and then they published the third one, The Butterfly House, and now the fourth one, The Harbor. But in terms of the English publication, they just kind of call The Butterfly House the second one and The Harbor the third one. I held off on reading Butterfly House for a long time because I was just like so annoyed that we skipped a step and was hoping that they were going to go back and publish the second one. But I got impatient because I really enjoyed The Tenant. I'd never really read a Danish crime novel before, or any like Nordic crime, and I loved it. Thought it was fantastic. And so eventually I got tired of waiting. I listened to The Butterfly House as well. I've done both of those on audio, and they're fantastic that way. Ended up liking The Butterfly House even more. Gave that one 5 stars. And then I didn't want to wait until an audiobook became available for The Harbor, which is the third or fourth book in the series, depending how you look at it. So I read that one on ebook, and I don't know if that affected my enjoyment of it. I don't think that's the reason I only ended up giving this one 3 stars. So this series follows Jeppe Kerner, who is kind of your typical divorced, kind of sad a police investigator, and then his partner is Annette Werner. He has a much more like boisterous personality. In this particular book, they're actually investigating the disappearance and potential murder of a teenager. And as the title suggests, the disappearance seems to have occurred around a harbor. What exactly is it that I didn't like as much about this book? One thing I didn't like about it is that there's sort of a potential for infidelity plot line, and that's just not really my vibe. I don't like infidelity plots at all. I don't know exactly what it is, but there was something about this particular book that I just didn't find as exciting as the first couple. I think it just didn't have the same kind of momentum as the first couple. So still a solid enough book, but definitely not my favorite of the series. But I will say I really do recommend The Tenant, and heartily recommend The Butterfly House if you haven't read those ones. So that is The Harbor by Katrine Engberg. At this point in September, I was finding myself kind of burnt out on newer books a little bit. Not so much necessarily the ones that I've talked about already, but during the summer I listened to quite a few newer releases and found a lot of them pretty disappointing. I think there's multiple reasons for that. Some of it is just ideological. Sometimes your worldview doesn't really line up with the author's worldview, and I find that increasingly a problem with new fiction. I do enjoy reading things that are coming from a perspective other than mine, obviously, and it's not like I don't want to read anything I disagree with, but sometimes you just get tired of so much of similar stuff that you don't necessarily prefer. The other issue is that when you're reading all new releases, these aren't things that have been like heavily vetted yet. They haven't stood the test of time. And so some of these books are really just going to fall by the wayside in a couple of years, and nobody's really going to care about them anymore. And, you know, that's the quality of some of them, and that's fine. That's how books work. But I really just found myself craving some things that have stood the test of time, and perhaps some things that come from another period of time where people were maybe thinking about certain things differently. I read a quote from C.S. Lewis once that I find really helpful and that came to mind when I was getting tired of some of these brand new novels. And he was talking more about like ancient Christian texts as opposed to like modern theology when he was talking about this, but I do think it kind of applies, so I'm going to read this. It is from Lewis' Introduction to Athanasius on the Incarnation, and this is what he says. It is a good rule, after reading a new book, never to allow yourself another new one till you have read an old one in between. If that is too much for you, you should at least read one old one to every 3 new ones. Every age has its own outlook. It is specially good at seeing certain truths and specially liable to make certain mistakes. We all, therefore, need the books that will correct the characteristic mistakes of our own period, and that means the old books. All contemporary writers share to some extent the contemporary outlook, even those like myself who seem most opposed to it. Nothing strikes me more when I read the controversies of past ages than the fact that both sides were usually assuming without question a good deal which we should now absolutely deny. And so that's kind of a lot of what I was thinking about when I decided that I kind of wanted to get back into reading some more classics, a large variety of time period in terms of when things were published. I tend to read more older books in print, but when it comes to my audiobooks, this is an easy way for me to get brand new books without spending a bunch of money on them. And so I just decided that I wanted to lean into classics again for a little bit. And so, all that being said, the first book sort of in that category that I chose to listen to was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beatristow. This is obviously an American classic. It's a long book, but I had a trip to take, and so I decided that I would spend most of the probably 14 hours or so of driving that I did listening to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which I think the audiobook was something like 20 hours, though I did speed it up a little bit. Uncle Tom's Cabin follows a slave named Tom, as well as some other slaves who you do get to see sort of parts of their journey. At the beginning of the book, Uncle Tom is being sold because his owner, while a man who has a very good wife and a man who generally treats his slaves fairly well, is also not a very wise man, and he's gotten in debt with a very unscrupulous slave trader, and the only way that he can sort of make this man go away is to sell him a couple of his very valued slaves. Tom practically runs the plantation for this man, but he is willing to go in order to save the plantation because otherwise they're going to go under and everyone's going to end up being sold. So this sort of starts Tom on a journey as he is sold from place to place and encounters various kinds of owners and other slaves. And you also at the same time are following some younger slaves who are making the choice to escape to Canada, whereas Uncle Tom is sort of making the opposite choice of just sticking with whoever he's sold to and trying to be the best servant that he can be to the people that he's working for, and more importantly, being a good example and a help to the other slaves around him. I didn't really know this going in, but Uncle Tom's Cabin is like a very Christian book. It's very explicitly religious, which, given the context, makes a lot of sense, but I hadn't really thought about before. Uncle Tom is very serious about his faith and sort of sees it as his role to bring the hope of Jesus to the other people around him. This book started off narratively really strong. I found it really interesting. There's a great breadth of character. There were actually some pretty funny moments near the beginning, and you also get to really see how different people think about slavery. There are slaves who think differently from each other about it. There are owners who think differently about it from each other. And Harriet Beecher-Stowe does a really good job, I feel like, of sort of poking fun at and poking holes in the beliefs of people who think that slavery is a great idea, but like also showing like why they think that, and not necessarily asking you to empathize with them, but asking you to answer the question, if this is the kind of society that you were brought up in, would you be any different? Or would you just assume that since this is how things are done, this is how I must continue to do them? And so I think she does a really good job of like a balanced portrayal of that. I did find that the book ended up getting quite long. A lot of books that were written before we had easier ways to edit, like we do with computers, the revision just isn't there, so things don't really get shortened the way that they would now, I think. So this book does get quite lengthy, and there's certain parts of it that kind of go on and maybe don't contribute the most to the story. But overall, I think it's really interesting and well worth reading, particularly just as a historical document and a novel that was pretty important at the time that it was written. It was really refreshing to read a book that came from a place of such like strong Christian conviction. And I mean, obviously this book has what we would now consider flaws in it. Obviously the N-word appears many times in this book. I wouldn't say in a way that like necessarily condones it, but it was just a part of the vernacular of the time, and so there it is. And also, as again, very common for the time, the author makes a lot of sort of sweeping generalizations about like what people of a certain race are often like. And while we can say, probably accurately sometimes, that like a lot of people from say one country are a certain way, like the whole, you know, Canadians are nice and polite thing, there may be some credence to that. We may kind of like raise an eyebrow at some of the things Harriet Beecher Stowe has to say, particularly about African people. And so, you know, it's not a perfect book, perhaps, in terms of being politically correct, and it's certainly not a perfect book in terms of being a really consistently paced narrative, but I do think it's a good book. I do think it's worth your time. Something that I didn't realize about this book is that it was written before the Civil War actually happened, which makes a lot of sense because the Civil War doesn't come up in the book. It's claimed that Lincoln said when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little woman that started this great war." And so this is a book that impacted the world. It made a lot of people mad, but I think it also gave a lot of people a window into oppression that was maybe easy for them to ignore. And so I think it's worth reading just to get a little bit better of an understanding of what America at that time might have been like. And so I really appreciated it. I think Harriet Beecher Stowe had to have viewed writing that book as a mission. I think that's pretty clear in the book. So I definitely recommend checking out Uncle Tom's Cabin if you have the chance. The audiobook I listened to was pretty good, and I think was definitely an easier way to get through it than it would have been just to like pick it up and read it. So that is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The next book that I listened to was Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce. Now, technically, you might argue that this wasn't really a book because it's actually an adaptation of the book for radio. It was on Libby as an audiobook, but it's a BBC dramatization. I have not read the book, so I don't know how far the dramatization strays from the book. I've seen this called a time slip story. So basically, Tom's brother is sick. He has, I think, the measles, and so he has to go away and stay with his aunt and uncle, and they live in a flat, and Tom's sad that there's no like garden to play in, and then he wakes up in the middle of the night and sees that outside there's a garden that wasn't there before, and he meets this girl there who he like goes out and plays with at night, and then it's sort of like a mystery of him trying to figure out how all of this works and who she is and what's going on. It was fine. I ended up giving this one 3 stars. Again, I guess this is Philippa Pierce's most famous novel. Came out in the 50s, I think. Sort of maybe a lesser known children's classic. I didn't know very much about it going in, and I just sort of thought it was fine. It was short, it was kind of fun, but it wasn't like laugh out loud funny, and the sort of solution to the puzzle didn't end up being all that interesting to me. So I would probably say, unless you have some particular reason to be interested in it, I would probably give this one a pass, but like also it's quick enough that like you're not going to be kicking yourself over the time that you spent listening to it or reading it. So that is Tom's Midnight Garden by Philippa Pierce. The next book that I listened to was also a children's classic, and that is 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. I think I've seen at least parts of both the animated and live action Disney movies, and my grandma also had like the Disney like picture book of 101 Dalmatians, and I remember looking at that a lot when I was at her house. And so I just thought it'd be kind of fun to know what the sort of real story was like and how much it differs from the Disney movies. There are some things that I found were some interesting details. I'm pretty sure in the Disney movie, Pongo and Perdita are sort of the mom and dad dog. In this one, it's Pongo and Mrs. Pongo, and Perdita is a whole other dog. So that was kind of interesting. Also, Cruella de Vil has a husband, which I don't recall being a thing in the movies, but maybe I'm just not remembering right. So that was kind of interesting. Also, Cruella de Vil is always cold, which I guess explains the affinity for fur and like loves black pepper to a ridiculous degree, which relatable. I might be Cruella de Vil. This book was fun. It was fine. There were some like moments of it that I found really charming. There's some sort of like Christmas related moments that I found like a little bit moving actually. And I also like, this is the part of the book that I always really remember is the barking communication system that the dogs have, where they like bark to the dog on the next street, and they like have this whole like system of communication where one dog like talks to the next one. I always just found that really charming as a kid, and I still did when I was listening to this as an adult. I will say there were like a couple of aspects of the book that I didn't love. Pongo is like really smart. That's like really emphasized in the novel, and Mrs. Pongo, not so much. And that's like a pretty consistent theme, and it gets a little old after a while. They make up also a big deal of sort of the strength disparity of like the male versus female pups, even when they're like really small. And I don't know very much about dogs, but I don't know if that's true. Like when they're just little puppies, I kind of am doubtful that the boy puppies are just always like stronger and tougher than the girl puppies. So there was some like slightly weird gender stuff there. Again, this is a book published in the 50s, so perhaps not surprising, but it was written by a woman, so I think that's why it took me off guard. But overall, it was a fun little book. Again, a short one. I enjoyed my time. I'm not really an animal person, but it made me kind of like look at the dogs when I was like out walking around listening to this. So it was a fun little book. That's 101 Dalmatians by Dodie Smith. The next book I read was a slightly more modern choice, but still almost as old as me, and that is Jurassic Park #2, The Lost World by Michael Crichton. This is a contentious book. I know a lot of people really don't like it. Lots of people who love Jurassic Park, the book and the movie, absolutely hate this book. I gave it the same rating I gave Jurassic Park, which was 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I'm not apologizing for it. I really enjoyed reading Jurassic Park a lot. I have such like a particular memory of it because I actually was reading it when I moved house, and so I remember like lying on my mattress on the floor of my new bedroom because I hadn't set up my bed frame yet on just like a hot July night and reading Jurassic Park, and it was just like a great summer book. And so that's why I chose to go ahead and listen to The Lost World this summer, or this fall, I suppose, but we've been having really nice weather still, so practically summer. Now, spoiler for a quick second on this one. It's more of a spoiler for the ending of Jurassic Park. In Jurassic Park, at the end of the book, Ian Malcolm actually gets killed. Obviously, that's a pretty big difference in tone between Jurassic Park, the book, and Jurassic Park, the movie, where Ian Malcolm survives. But then at the beginning of The Lost World, the book, Ian Malcolm is back, baby. He's the main character. That's who we're following. And so some people take issue with that, and I understand that. And people say that the reason for that was because they wanted Jeff Goldblum back in the movie because the actor who played Dr. Grant wasn't going to come back for a second movie. And so Michael Crichton wrote the book like as preparation for the movie. It was just a nice book to read while you're like out walking around, and I really enjoyed the experience. I'm not looking for anything deep from Jurassic Park, really is the thing. There are some interesting ideas, like philosophically, that pop up here and there, and I appreciate that, but for the most part, you're really just in it for the action, and I thought it was fun. I looked at some of the bad reviews because I know it's not a super popular book and I kind of wanted to know why. Some people argue that the only characters who survive or the only characters who are good are geniuses, and so it's like geniuses good, regular people bad, Michael Crichton patting himself on the back. I didn't really feel that way. I can kind of see what they mean in a way, but I just don't think it's really true. The villains in the story, it's not really so much about them not being geniuses, it's more about what they choose to do with their resources. And so if you can get past that one little thing, there was nothing to make me particularly dislike this book. I appreciated the different perspectives that the characters had on certain issues. There's one character that I particularly like named Doc Thorne, who is like an engineer. He used to work at a university, became sort of really disenchanted with the higher education system and how it works, which was really interesting because this was written in the 90s, and I think things have only gone more in that arguably negative direction since then. So then he just dedicates himself to much more like practical pursuits, and I just really appreciated him and like his perspective on things. That is The Lost World by Michael Crichton. I liked it as good as Jurassic Park. I'm here for your hate comments. Next book. Final book that I listened to in September called Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder and Memory in Northern Ireland by Patrick Radden Keefe. I listened to Empire of Pain by the same author earlier this year, which is about the Sackler family who started one of the pharmaceutical companies that is sort of partially responsible for the opioid crisis. And that was a really fascinating book. Thought it was great, gave it 5 stars. So I was very interested to read more like really engaging nonfiction like that from this author. So Say Nothing is about the troubles in Ireland, really focusing on the IRA and particularly the disappearance of Jean McConville, a single mother of 10 children who was just taken from her home one night and her children never saw again. The structure of the book is like not as clear as it could have been, I felt. The centrality of that issue, like to the story, was not immediately clear, and maybe that was intentional to kind of like keep you guessing about who was involved and who was responsible. But that initially kind of seemed like, oh, here's just like one incident from the troubles that they're reporting, and then it's kind of like, oh no, everything kind of like comes around this. So I have to say, I didn't find this book quite as engaging and well written as Empire of Pain. I still ended up giving it 4 stars. I thought it was really good. I learned some things about the Troubles, which I didn't know that much about. This was really focusing on the more recent years of conflict in Ireland. So a lot of the book took place in sort of the 70s and 80s. The kind of book where you do come out feeling still confused and uncertain about like how things should have gone, like how these problems should have been dealt with, you know, how much who was in the wrong and who was in the right. The Irish situation is a really complicated one, and one that I don't know a whole lot about. So surprise, surprise, I read one book about it and can't come to like a solid conclusion about who was right and who was wrong in the whole thing. But it was very interesting, and I will probably read more of Patrick Radden Keefe's work because he is a very good author and chooses, you know, interesting and complicated topics for his work. And I don't tend to read a lot of nonfiction, but it's nice when you can find some that like really grabs you. So that is the last book that I read in September this year. So that was a total of 8 books. You may have noticed every single one of them was either a 3 or 4 star read, which is kind of interesting. I wonder if that's maybe partly because I strayed away from like new fiction and more towards classics and nonfiction, and so it was less like up and down, 1-star, 5-star kind of a situation. Much more even overall. It's always a little disappointing when you read so many books without coming across like a really top-notch one. I didn't like push myself through any like 1-2-star kind of garbage or things that just like, really were not for me. So overall, I would say a good month for audiobooks, and maybe next month I'll read some actual paper books more so. Just this one in paper and then one ebook. Hopefully, yeah, I can do a little better that way. But that's what I always say. Thank heaven for audiobooks. They're great. If you want to share about anything that you read in September, I would love to hear. If you have thoughts about any of the books that I quickly reviewed here, I would very much like to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much for being here. If you've enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it so much if you gave it a like, subscribed, left a comment, all that good stuff. Thank you very much for doing that, and I will see you another time. All right, bye.